Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kaligan here with another week of World War III analysis. A lot is going on as we speak. Israeli forces are striking Yemen, striking the Hodeidah region, their ports where they have launched strikes on Israel recently. The Houthis launched one of their first direct strikes on Tel Aviv with a new Iranian drone, so there's big escalations in the Holy Land War, in the Levant. Of course, Netanyahu recently visited Rafah. Plans for the Lebanon invasion continue to move forward, as well as a myriad of other issues. There was more fallout in the U.S. from, the Trump assassination attempt, from now Biden's continued speculation on stepping out of the race. We're going to get into all of that. Potentially the deep state blaming Iran for the assassination of Trump. Recently, there was the largest worldwide IT failure, possibly in world history. So we're going to be talking about all of this. We're going to be talking about new bases in northern Cyprus. We're going to be talking about Strelkov. We're going to be talking about France and some of their nonsense. So with all of that, let's get right into it. Dmitry, how are you doing this week?
Doing good, Conrad. And yes, there's been breaking news, frankly. Just in the last hour, we've seen a massive Israeli airstrike on Yemen, on the port city of Al Hodeidah, which essentially has a lot of Yemenis infrastructure. Definitely looks like either a fuel refinery or essentially an oil storage facility. And the Israelis have struck it very strongly. And it has caused quite a powerful blast. Frankly, we've not seen blasts like that in the Ukraine in quite some time because, again, Ukrainian infrastructure seems to be more spread out. But again, Yemen in the desert, there seems to be like a pretty broad concentration around the port areas. And Israel has chosen to retaliate on the Houthis, right? Because, again, Conrad, the most important factor here is that Israel has claimed responsibility already, and they've claimed that this is a retaliatory strike for what we saw essentially just one, or I guess as you're listening to this recording, it'll be about 2 or 3 days ago. Allegedly, the Houthis have flown a couple of drones into Tel Aviv, and this is, we're talking more than 1,000 kilometers away. And these drones somehow got through the Iron Dome and have exploded in Tel Aviv, killing one person and injuring a few more. So really not that heavy of a burden on the Israeli population, nor really an extreme strike compared to some of the bombardment that the Hezbollah has been dishing out on the Israelis. But nevertheless, the Israeli response seems to have been quite strong-handed. They've used at least 5 F-16s, I believe 8 F-35s, and just to sort of explain, the Lockheed Martin F-35 bomber, that's a plane of such high technology. The Ukrainians aren't even going to get any of these. They're going to get F-16s, and F-35s have, at least according to official sources, stealth technology, so they can bypass radar. As you can imagine, the Houthis don't have anything to kind of stop these high-powered killing machines in the air. And these bombs that were dropped on the Al Hodeidah port refinery, I think, was just the beginning, perhaps. And naturally, the UK and the US have been actually refueling these planes in the air as they've done a sortie and in about half an hour bombed some of the key sites around Yemen. And they've essentially claimed that the port refinery at Al Hodeidah that was bombed was actually a terrorist refueling facility because, well, I'm not sure how they've designated it a terrorist site, but it's very similar to how Israel designates any particular bombing site in either Rafah or anywhere in Gaza or even southern Lebanon, as, any target is allegedly a terrorist affiliated area. So it gets bombed and they can come out of this with like little or minimal accountability. But what's interesting regarding accountability, Conrad, is the fact that the US, the Biden administration, Lloyd Austin, the head of the defense sector, they've come out and officially stated that the US government has nothing to do with this bombardment, but we do know they've probably greenlit it because the Israeli warplanes were being refueled in the air over the Red Sea by US refueling planes. So that's quite key here. So the US fleet that we see positioned in the Red Sea is actually assisting this bombardment. And as we can probably tell, the casualty numbers haven't even come out as we're recording this, but they are already higher than that of the alleged Houthi drone bombardment. This Iranian-supported regime drone bombardment of Tel Aviv, this holy New Jerusalem city that Israel has built on the once established the Tribe of Dan land on the coast of the Mediterranean. So it's very interesting how Israel always, whenever you strike them in any sort of retaliatory capacity, they always respond much stronger. And vengeance is always one of these weapons that the Israelis have been utilizing with some significant capacity. And it's almost like a terror strike on the Houthis, just kind of telling them that you have to stop long-range bombing and sending these various drones at Israel because we will always respond more in a more heavy-handed fashion. So really, as the statistics come out, Conrad, I think we'll see definitely the casualties will be a lot higher. We know there are civilian workers at these refineries. The explosion was so savage. It actually, I'm not sure if there will be any survivors, frankly, from anybody who was on site at the day. But yes, it's looking like Israel is taking this extremely seriously. And this has been the longest range bombardment by Israeli planes, I believe, in their history, because they flew over 1,000 kilometers in probably a matter of hours, refueled, and then headed back home. So quite an effective operation by Israeli standards, but it does show that Israel is out here playing for keeps, and they're not going to take any Houthi disrespect in the next coming few months.
It's quite an incredible escalation. Like you said, Israeli Air Force, they don't usually fly, this far afield, but I guess they felt it was necessary in response to the fact that this Houthi, I guess Iranian tech-based drone, the Samsad 3, was able to basically completely bypass any Iron Dome defenses at all and strike the U.S. consulate in Tel Aviv. I believe one person died and others were injured, which I guess to Israel that was deemed too dramatic of an escalation to go without basically making the war between Yemen and Israel as two countries more of an official thing. And of course, the US seems to support it because obviously the consulate was involved, which would make sense. There's even reports that the intelligence in general was involved in the strike, that it was really just the Israeli hardware was used and it was very much a US strike, despite the reality or the fact that, Lloyd Austin and the State Department seemed to be trying to generally distance themselves from it, probably because Biden is trying to offshore a lot of his failures onto the Israeli hardliners in the region. And, Axios was reporting that it was the US that, that was a report from Axios. And I think the situation when it comes to the Houthis is their immediate response was, of course, that this will only harden our resolve to continue defending Gaza. We're going to strike any Arab country that shoots down our strikes on Israel. We're going to continue our strikes on Israel, all these sorts of things. That being said, they're enough of a, I don't want to say ragtag, but, they were not capable of defending themselves in any capacity, it seems, from these attacks. I don't know if they even have air defense. And if they're losing this much, fuel in these kinds of massive civilian infrastructure power stations, it might be a hard thing to maintain. Obviously, I believe Iran is supporting them pretty heavily, which perhaps after this, Iran will increase that even more. But without that support, it would probably be a pretty tough task for them to do this. Obviously, the fact that they were able to make that drone attack work is pretty legendary, but one person dead in a drone attack, that's not enough to actually, wage war against Israel and cripple them and prevent yourself from getting bombed and whatnot. But, I believe they are also holding out for Hezbollah, who recently had another one of their leaders killed in Lebanon in an airstrike. I believe over 4 people were killed, 18 plus injured in this airstrike on Lebanon by Israeli forces. And in response, Hezbollah has been bombarding the north of Israel, which has been a pretty dramatic thing to see. Obviously, Kiryat Shmona has been almost completely evacuated at this point. We remember last week the mayor talked about how our only option is to push, into Lebanon, create a big corridor so that his city basically was no longer a border city with, the Goyim, Amalek. And the Golan Heights has been being heavily struck, and we've seen joint drills now between Hezbollah and the Shia resistance forces from Iraq and Syria and others that have been training, near the border of the Golan Heights. So the whole region is a major tinderbox. We see all sorts of, I think it was the Daily Mail saying that World War III is about to start on the Lebanese-Israel border. So a lot of dramatic escalations. We're seeing regime propaganda from the US and UK side trying to claim that Russia is going to arm the Houthis, which, frankly, that would be kind of based, but I haven't seen any actual evidence for that. I think that Russia is far too entangled in the politics of Israel-Palestine to so brazenly arm like the one group that is like most actively at war with Israel right now. So a lot of interesting hypotheses up in the air from everybody trying to get their angle into the ear of the people in power. Of course, we see Trump negotiating on all of these things already, even though he hasn't even been elected yet. It's pretty much a done deal. Zelensky, other world leaders are starting to already deal with Trump. I'm sure that right after the election, even when he's not inaugurated yet, he'll already be operating in a foreign policy leadership position. These people know that there's really no reason in addressing Joe and his team at this point. Like, what are they going to do? We are hearing rumors that they are trying to put sanctions on some of the hardliners like Smotrich and Ben Gvir. We'll get into that in a second when we talk about some of the stuff in the West Bank. But unless you have anything else to say about the attacks on Yemen or the Yemeni strike on Tel Aviv, Dimitri, we probably got to talk about the Hezbollah situation because they've had a lot of commanders taken out in the past few weeks, and I'm wondering if at a certain level that'll actually start to have an effect on their chain of command and on their, power and effectiveness.
Well, I think it's very curious because we do see essentially Hezbollah sort of line commanders getting taken out, and a lot of them quite senior. But also, I would wage this particular middle management of Hezbollah maybe getting a little bit nervous because, frankly, Nasrallah has made very broad promises. He has, of course, called Hamas martyrs, and he's called the future fighters for Hezbollah martyrs as well in the Islamic sense. But how long exactly will they be holding out before any further action, any sort of more widespread, shall we say, intervention into Israel would be taking place? Because we have spoken about, the Israeli intervention into southern Lebanon, but what else can Hezbollah actually offer to support both the Palestinians as well as the heavily affected southern Lebanese population? Because all eyes are essentially on Nasrallah, on the upper leadership of Hezbollah, and a lot of these middle management officers, generals within Hezbollah are now legitimate targets for Israel, and Israel is making sure they are taking them out step by step. And in fact, if Nasrallah does not make any moves, you're right, Conrad. There could be this pressure to actually perhaps even have him removed. I know that's a stretch, but we do see similar sort of tendencies on the Israeli side, right? With essentially Netanyahu receiving a lot of pressure. He has to physically attend the Rafah crossing in the south and actually, put on a helmet and a Kevlar and actually be there amongst the troops in order to secure his own reputation, alongside people like Ben Gvir and Yoel Gallant, I suppose his opponent, right, in the Israeli government and the cabinet. So he does, even Netanyahu himself, he understands his position in Israeli politics is always dwindling. It's always like affected by the whims of the crowd. And so he must actually appear as this like war-worthy leader. So I'm not quite sure exactly, because again, all the news we're receiving from Hezbollah, from South Lebanon, Conrad, is very much biased from the prism, from the perspective of the Hezbollah leadership itself. But do we actually know what the opinions are on the inside? They obviously wouldn't be showing any weakness, not to the Zionist regime at the moment. But we have to kind of analyze the situation and give our perspective on it. Naturally, perhaps the fight is much bigger than anyone's sort of personal want for power in the Hezbollah leadership. So perhaps they're all willing to actually fight Israel until the end, and they're willing to put themselves at risk of these Israeli deadly bombings. And of course, the bombings would essentially endanger a lot of their families as well, because we do know Lebanese people, they do have really large families. There's probably a lot of spies integrated within the southern Lebanese community as well. We do know Israelis, Jews in general, come in all shapes and sizes, and they've probably integrated a lot of their Mossad agents into these communities a long time ago, right? Probably going back to the 2006 war between Lebanon and Israel. So it's quite, I think, dangerous if you're a Hezbollah commander in South Lebanon at the moment. But yes, these assassinations, the only thing Hezbollah has been doing, well, the only thing, it has been heavily bombarding the north Israel, the entirety of the north of Israel. So the entire northern area of the Holy Land, north of the Sea of Galilee, has been a danger zone. A lot of Israelis, frankly, they've already lost a lot of spirit, so they're already migrating south, essentially becoming refugees. We're seeing, I think the numbers are reaching close to 100,000 Israelis who've lost their homes at the moment. The official numbers aren't really being given to us because, again, the Israelis are trying to keep their morale high. But yes, things are developing very, very rapidly. It doesn't look like there's any anticipation of a peace treaty between Hezbollah and Israel, especially not after what's recently taken place. And these assassinations, Conrad, are only pushing any hypothetical peace treaty back, not kind of forward.
Yeah, I think the situation with Hezbollah, again, you mentioned in the past episodes, it's already a war. It's just when is Israel going to put troops on the ground? And the recent commander that was killed was Ali Jafar Matuk. He was an operations officer in a unit responsible for attacks on the Ramim Ridge region, which has been areas where bases have come under a lot of fire from Hezbollah. You've seen a lot of the footage, I believe, from those bases getting struck with some of these, Hezbollah missiles and mortars and whatnot. But I think the situation in the Golan Heights is also interesting because we know that a lot of the Syrian resistance is going to be fighting. Obviously Assad is not going to be countering, the operations of these resistance forces because Israel bombs the Damascus airport and Syrian Arab army forces all the time. So even though he himself isn't going to necessarily wage a direct state war against Israel, he's happily going to allow for passage of weapons to Hezbollah and for these Shia militias to operate and perhaps move into the Golan Heights if Israel moves into southern Lebanon. So very interesting to say the least, as Isaac Swalem in our episode said that all these borders are nonsense and fake anyway. So perhaps we'll see some of them start to move, much like we're seeing borders start to move in Russia and Ukraine. But Netanyahu, of course, he has been in the hot seat this whole time, but he visited Rafah. He's got to do his Zelensky, make sure that he's showing his support for the troops and for the nationalist, Jewish supremacist, expansionist cause. So he's, pictured in some tanks in Rafah, in the Philadelphia corridor, which is a major red line for Egypt. They view that as Palestinian territory, if not, should be Egyptian territory, definitely not, definitely not Israeli territory. So they are definitely towing the line with some of these other Arab countries, which, again, though, like the Houthis pointed out, most of these other Arab countries are not willing, to pick up the mantle of, fighting back against Israel. So the Jews clearly know what they are and aren't able to get away with. But what we're seeing also with Netanyahu is on some of these Israeli news channels has this leaked audio of some of the left-wing opposition leadership, some of the leaders of these big anti-Netanyahu protests talking about assassinating Netanyahu, shooting down his plane, because I guess they're just getting sick and tired of waiting for the state of emergency because of the Gaza and Lebanon situations to die down, because they don't seem to be happy with how fast they're quote-unquote getting rid of this guy. It doesn't seem like it's happening at all, so they perhaps are like, let's just kill him, which, probably not a good look to have that, get leaked and now everybody's talking about it. They probably saw the Israeli right probably saw how much support Trump's getting from his failed assassination attempt and is like, man, if we can get people to think of Netanyahu this way, maybe, maybe we can get a little bit more support and not immediately get driven out when the war, dies down at all, which again, I don't think it will, because again, we're in World War III. We're in the cascading escalatory phase where things are just going to go from bad to worse. At least that's my perspective. But yeah, the other big development, of course, we see Biden preparing to possibly to sanction Bezalel Smotrich and his party, Ben Gvir, the hardcore religious expansionist, ultranationalist Kahanists. The ICC and the UN have condemned all Israeli settlements in the West Bank and I guess formerly in Gaza, of course, but they've condemned all of them, said that Israel needs to abandon them, that Israel is operating an apartheid state, including all of the settlements in East Jerusalem and everything. So the UN is coming out basically in support of Palestinian statehood. But then, of course, Smotrich and Ben Gvir come out and say it's time for full West Bank annexation now. And there have even been recent changes in the status quo. The commander of the central region of the Israeli army, he signed a decision allowing the demolition of Palestinian homes and preventing the construction of any new areas in Area B of the Palestinian Authority. And that's a huge area. We talked about Area C, which is already directly under control of Smotrich, and they're expanding settlements now. Area B is moving full forward with the destruction of Palestinian homes. We're basically watching a slow-marched West Bank annexation happening before our very eyes. And, of course, Gallant, Netanyahu, everybody, across the political spectrum for the most part, condemned the ICC and the UN, discussions about condemning the settlements. And of course they said, Israelis, we're going to be in Israel, we're going to be in our territory where we need to be. So, very brazen, of course, in their, in their chauvinism. But the fact that Biden was talking about sanctioning these characters is, it shows that he's trying to garner that last little bit of progressive support now that Trump is leading in the national popular vote. Trump is leading in Virginia. Trump is leading in Pennsylvania, all the swing states, and some of these other crazy states that people wouldn't even have thought would flip. It seems that Trump is really going to be the one that sweeps this thing, and of course that will probably be partially due to his commitments to Israel. But again, we'll see obviously the speculation on who tried to assassinate Trump. The deep state seems to be trying to pin it on Iran, which I believe is ridiculous. Who knows if we'll see Iran also blamed somehow on some of these IT failures, and as the potential for war with Iran ramps up, they will be blamed for more and more just things that the powers that be want to have them believe affect, Americans' everyday lives. If they can blame Iran for something that affects someone at the supermarket or something like that, they'd love to do that because that's something that would actually gin up popular support for a war against Iran. But I think the fact that all of these characters in the Israeli government, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, the ultranationalists that do in some capacity support Netanyahu when they view it's convenient for them, they're committed to West Bank annexation, and that's because I think they know that war with Iran is inevitable, so they need to gobble up as much territory as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think they're looking to secure as much territory, yes, yeah, you're right, as possible prior to any, proper World War III type escalation. Perhaps, looking forward into the future, they are viewing the risk of, say, more further Iranian drones actually crossing that Mesopotamian desert heading into Israel. So they will need to secure some of that West Bank territory in order to create more of a buffer before these drones reach some key cities, for example, the Jewish districts of Jerusalem, or perhaps even the city of Tel Aviv. Aviv, or maybe even the port city of Haifa. So again, I think they're looking forward into the future. And while the Biden administration is still in power, they do have this sort of freedom to act because we haven't really seen that administration do anything to stop them prior. For example, the Gazan war crimes that the Israelis have committed still have pretty much gone unanswered. And yes, Biden can try and backtrack and play up to these AOC pro-Palestinian people within the Democrat Party, but really it's not going to win the Democrats any sympathies. The Democrats, the only hope they really have is for Biden to go away and the new leaders of the Democrat Party, Nancy Pelosi perhaps, and those who will come after her to actually paint the Democrats as the pro-Palestinian party, but that'll be difficult to argue, Conrad, given the fact that all of these atrocities of Israel actually took place under a Democrat presidency. So it will be a really kind of hard sell, I believe, on that end. But naturally, Trump doesn't make this any easier on us, and JD Vance as well, this anti-Iranian, pro-Zionist rhetoric that we've just seen at the RNC over the last 3 days. It's just been quite intensely pro-Zionist, and so I think this main theme of we must support Israel against its sort of these hardcore Islamist enemies, including Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, like the big baddies, Houthis especially, is still preeminent amongst the Republicans, which is very unfortunate. We thought, Conrad, that perhaps over the last 8 months, maybe there would be some tactical considerations given to the fact that, well, Israeli support can perhaps lessen, and we can get away with it as sort of as an American dominant sort of America First party, right? Because the America First rhetoric was becoming quite popular online, but it does seem like the Israeli lobby, AIPAC, is still very much dominant within the Republican Party. The sponsors are still there, and we even have a man named Shabos giving a speech at the RNC. So it's all very questionable. And the fact that JD Vance's wife is Indian too, and India does have that strong anti-Muslim tendency leaning as well, needs to be considered. So there's even familial ties here that whenever there are Israelis or Jews involved, there's always that marital consideration. Even in Russian politics, you have to kind of have a look at who's married to whom, etc. But in any case, Conrad, we do see this really strong positioning of Trump, the Republican Party, in Israel's favor. They are playing the Zionist card quite strongly. And of course, the presence of Ivanka Trump, as well as her strange and very dangerous looking husband at the RNC, I think doesn't give us conservatives around the world any sort of hope for a anti-Zionist United States. I think we'll be seeing the same old political leanings of the US and even some of this bizarre rhetoric, right? We're not going to get too deep into these really questionable, probably fake news conspiracies, but the fact that Iran could have been behind the assassination attempt on Donald J. Trump, I think that's just not just bizarre, it's directly probably misinformation being thrown into the mix. And it's almost like the stuff we saw during the Dick Cheney, George Bush regime when they blamed Iraq directly for WMDs and other weapons of mass destruction. I mean, it's just absolutely absurd. And so the RNC, I think, has really cemented the Republican Party as this strongly Zionist-aligned coalition within the US, and just wondering what your thoughts are about it, Conrad, as someone from a deep, I suppose, red state, at least for now, and sort of what the opinions are over there.
Yeah, well, the RNC was a major snooze fest at the end of the day. Obviously, we got the announcement that JD Vance is going to be the next vice president as Trump's vice presidential nominee. His choice is his running mate, which, again, from a baseline perspective, he's definitely better than some of the alternatives. There was a chance someone said that it could have been Nikki Haley, that it could have been Marco Rubio. There was talk that it was going to be some of these less prominent people like Burgum or Ben Carson or somebody who I was more leaning in that direction because Vance, he's really tied up with some of these Teal Network people, although apparently that's no longer as much of a connection. He was a huge never Trumper. He is a big Israel supporter as well, of course. He recently spoke at that isolationist foreign policy think tank and basically outlined a quote-unquote America First foreign policy that's like, yeah, we're not going to be supporting Ukraine, we're not going to be this, that, or the other, but it is America First to support Israel, basically carving out the quote-unquote isolationist, anti-war, somehow pro-Israel position, which is just ridiculous, of course. His wife, of course, is Indian. She seems very nice, but we know how the Indians feel about Israel. They're like their strongest soldiers. So, if he's going to be, pro-Indian immigration, pro-Israel, it's not a huge victory, unfortunately. And I think there's even talk that getting somebody like Vance in as the VP, that might even make a Trump assassination attempt even more likely if Israel thinks they can get somebody that's much more amenable to just doing their bidding in power. They could just take out Trump, have the VP a seat, and that would be great. Again, I know people would try to they would then do that and then maybe try to blame it on Iran as well. So you get a double whammy. You go to war with Iran over the assassination that Israel did to get their guy in power. Again, I'm kind of, getting far afield, a little bit schizophrenic here, but we got to consider all of these options. And again, I don't despise J.D. Vance. I know he's said very positive things about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Apparently, he is in contact with the lawyers for the UOC and Metropolitan Onufri, which is good. I think with Trump's pick of Vance, it's a sign that we're going to see some really good things in Ukraine. We're going to be pulling out support there. We're going to see a negotiated settlement, perhaps even they'd be willing to cede more territory to the Russians to perhaps ensure that there's less persecution with, the religious question in mind, with the church jurisdiction question in mind, looking at the distribution of these schismatic parishes and trying to make sure that as many canonical churches are protected under, the Russian Orthodox Church itself as possible. So I think, again, that could be wishful thinking, but the best thing about Vance is that it points to a very likely positive development in Ukraine, but we see that already, and we see Zelensky saying that he's willing to have Russian negotiators now at the next round of negotiations, whenever that is. So that's probably the biggest white flag we've seen as far as the current territorial reality goes. But I think for Trump and the rest of the RNC situation, it was a horrible disaster. I found the first 10, 15 minutes of Trump's speech they were good. I think the recounting of the shooting was touching and everything, but then it just turned into another regular rambly Trump stump speech about all the other garbage, half the stuff that isn't even good. We had the Sikh prayer to Wagaduru or whatever. We had like a bajillion black guys talking about how America isn't racist. We had people that could barely speak English, about how, the illegal immigrants are hurting the legal immigrants and how we need more legal immigrants. And we had a guy named Shabbos Kestenbaum up there talking about how much he loves Israel, who just 10 days ago was saying how he didn't like Trump and believed in Russiagate and all this stuff. So kind of a clown show. The only good moments were the Hulk Hogan moment when he, ripped off his shirt, said, "Let Trumpomania run wild." Ted Cruz, of all people, had a pretty good speech on illegal immigration. Peter Navarro as well. But besides that, it was pretty much a snooze fest. I didn't even watch almost any of the speeches in full because they were so boring. But yeah, unfortunately, the RNC is totally, it's kind of totally usurped the MAGA movement. But that's not to say that we don't still need to get our people in there, try to revive something akin to Project 2025, despite the fact that Trump has disavowed it. We'll see how real that disavowal actually is. But Dimitri, unless you have anything to say about the RNC Biden situation, we probably should talk about the fact that Biden is, potentially about to drop out because we hear that the DNC, they're delaying the convention of the first week of August. They may even delay the presidential nominating aspect of it. And there was a huge push over the weekend to get, or rather through the week, to get Biden to resign over the weekend. Apparently that's kind of being pushed back against by Biden's allies. But Obama, the New York Times editorial board, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, apparently all want Biden to step down in some capacity. I think they want Kamala, or they want to do an open convention. That's kind of the discussion right now is, do we just prop Kamala up, or do we somehow have an open convention and try to get Bashir or Josh Shapiro to run? And the whole thing is just completely over. Like, they must already know that they're not going to win the presidency. If I were the Democrats, I'd almost be like, you know what? Let's just not run anyone for president and just put all the money into the House and the Senate and try to do that. But you can't do that because without a presidential candidate, no one would come out to vote for the House and the Senate. So my only option I see them having is they should just nominate RFK, but they'll never do that for obvious reasons. But Dimitri, do you have any thoughts on the potential for Biden to drop out? Do you think he will? I know there's word that on Sunday, that was when the announcement's coming, so that might be when people are listening to this. At this point, I don't think he's going to drop out of the race in the next week or so, but anything could happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a complete mess, similar to how the end speech, the end part of Trump's speech was also a bit of a mess. But the DNC, I mean, the situation is critical at this point. We've never seen, frankly, a presidential election get to this stage where it's so clearly in the basket of one particular camp, and the other side simply has to concede in a very honorable fashion, which is the Democrat Party really should do. But how do you do that without losing the hope of the Democrats for generations to come, right? And sort of future elections as well. They need to at least put up a fight. And I think, yeah, you're right. Biden, this whole I'm sick of COVID, I won't be giving any speeches in the next few days, was a little bit really wimpy looking. I'm not sure if even he said that or if that was just an excuse. Really, we can't tell. given the amount of chemicals they're probably injecting him with is probably like quadruple, like quintuple boosted at this point. So it's really hard to actually tell what's happening behind the scenes with his medication. But you're right. The Kamala Harris push and the fact that Biden himself said that Kamala Harris would make a great president recently, I think this does point towards a potential transitioning. And in fact, they could simply take Biden out just simply by claiming that his health has worsened over the last few weeks. And in fact, Kamala will need to step up to the plate and perhaps just lose in a sort of honorable fashion, maybe run in any future elections. I don't think any other person has sort of the media clout. Maybe Newsom or, as you said, RFK, but RFK is way too questionable of a character for the Democrats. The other thing I briefly wanted to mention was the ending of Trump's speech. I think besides mentioning Venezuela, Bukele, and sort of attacking some of these South American leaders for some of their positive developments in their own countries, Trump did in fact mention Viktor Orban and the fact that Viktor did try and sue for peace between Ukraine and Russia. So he did mention what we spoke about, frankly, and this was borderline a conspiracy theory that Viktor Orban was carrying these secret messages from Putin and Zelensky to Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, literally 24 hours before the assassination attempt by that really strange Crooks character. And in fact, it turned out that Trump actually does mention the fact that Viktor Orban is one of his top guys in Eastern Europe. And perhaps even that interview between Viktor Orban and Tucker Carlson actually established that strong link between Donald Trump. But yeah, just going back to the Democrat situation, it's looking quite bad. I don't think the Democrats, and frankly, it's so bad, Conrad. And how can you judge by how bad it is? It's when we see Archbishop Elpidopoulos giving a ecumenist type speech at the RNC, when he's switching sides, when he's not wearing a mask and he's not advocating for Planned Parenthood or something, or BLM, and he's actually openly speaking out in favor of the Republicans, when he was frankly always very strongly in the Democrat camp. At least they claim, the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of the United States of America, it's always kind of claimed to be neutral. But we have seen Elpidopoulos even openly, I believe, at the last election, he was pro-Biden. And here we have him at the RNC, opening prayers alongside Waheguru and all these other demonic entities and, their sort of priestesses. So it's unfortunate. It's a very ecumenist speech. I know some Orthodox Christians online had sort of positive things to say about it. They claimed that, well, look, he's not canonically not allowed. It's not like a joint prayer or anything. It's just a proclamation in front of a bunch of non-Orthodox people. And yes, but we do understand how others will view it. Others and those who aren't Orthodox will view it as an ecumenist participation of sorts, which will give the Orthodox Church a bad light in terms of our alleged inclusivity, bringing in other religions into this big tent of Orthodox Christianity, which definitely is not the case. So that's an unfortunate show of strength by the Republicans, right? The fact that Elpidopoulos has changed camps, at least in my opinion. But yes, Donald Trump, definitely a lot of talking about foreign policy here, which I think is really important for this show, and viewing this Russia-Ukraine conflict into the future, and even these proclamations by Zelensky, Conrad, that he's openly stated that allegedly Trump gave him a call within like 24 hours, 48 hours after the assassination attempt, and spoken about an apparent deal that they can make and that they can come to the table and speak about peace. Zelensky is acting like a really good puppy. And I think the main consideration here, Conrad, is this is how Trump probably does his politics. Notice he's mentioned he never started a war, but he will offer Russia and Ukraine this double ultimatum project. And the only problem with this double ultimatum, and I'll kind of explain it succinctly here, the double ultimatum will consist of him speaking to Zelensky very frankly and stating, look, if you're not going to agree to a peace treaty with Putin, we're going to reduce drastically all the aid that Ukraine is going to get. So the country will essentially collapse under this pressure of debt and sort of the need for rebuilding its infrastructure, the lack of ammunition that they'll receive from other European countries, including NATO allies. So that's the ultimatum that they'll give to the Ukraine. The ultimatum to Russia will be very similar. They'll just say, well, look, President Putin, if you don't go for a deal with Ukraine right now with Zelensky, we're going to continue funding Ukraine forever. We'll just keep printing money, and this sort of the well will never dry out. And in fact, the 60 billion American dollars, just affirmed a couple of months ago, is still pouring into Ukraine right now. They're obtaining F-16s, and the Russian economy, despite the fact that the inflation is slightly increasing, going up, it's also buckling under the pressure. I mean, all the countries are at the moment. The world is in this weird state of a recession, so it's not really looking the best long term, right? There is a slight GDP growth in Russia this year annually, but generally speaking, Trump could offer this double ultimatum. The only issue here, Conrad, is if Trump does this strong man sort of powerful move, if both sides reject the ultimatum offered to them, the peace talks go nowhere. And so, in fact, we'll be back to this starting ground, back to this late 2022 scenario where both sides are not at the table and nobody's accepting any deals. So, we're not sure if Trump will succeed in this sort of approach of his, but at the moment he's looking quite strong. And Putin has, congratulated him on the fact that he survived the assassination attempt and said that it's a good thing. And Putin himself actually allegedly is very much, despite the fact that he's joked before for being pro-Biden, I think he does look forward to a Trump presidency simply because Trump is more Zionist leaning, and perhaps there is a higher chance that the American administration will move more of its attention to the Middle East rather than that Russia Eastern European bloc.
No, I think that's a really good point. And even though Putin doesn't necessarily view Trump as some kind of ally, he views the immediate interests as beneficial to the current situation in Ukraine, which is obviously true. And I think when it comes to the other situation, which is the analysis regarding the Trump assassination, I do believe that there's something up. There's been some interesting analysis. I saw some sound analysis of the bullets that believe that it was two different guns that were firing from, two different shooters and whatnot. Obviously, there's the weird situation going on at the water tower, a lot of these other things. I don't believe that it was faked insofar as Trump was somehow involved and had fake blood. Of course, I was open to those kinds of things because of all sorts of, the depths of some of these conspiracies, but I don't think that was exactly what was going on. I do think it probably was a actual assassination attempt. So there's my bone to the conspiracies, but I think we have to move on. We're getting far into the episode. We got to talk about this IT failure really quick. I know it was mostly CrowdStrike, and what seems to be the main story is that CrowdStrike basically forced an update, and I don't know the actual technical analysis, but it was this update that went through and it basically caused all Windows computers that were running CrowdStrike at these major corporations to blue screen and not be usable. So we saw in America, at least, United Airlines, Delta, American Airlines all ground their flights. In Australia, we saw Sky News. In the UK, Sky News was down everywhere. We saw all sorts of companies. I mean, people I know who work retail, they were having to do some of their cashiering by hand and paper and everything for the beginning of the day. Apparently, this was the largest IT outage in the world in some capacity. So I guess the fact that it was someone pushing through an update with some kind of line of code entered in wrong. I was joking with somebody that, this was an Indian attack on the world infrastructure because I think the CrowdStrike, CTOs and whatnot are all Indians. So I think if you looked into this and the chain of command on where it went wrong, you'd probably find a few Brahmins, a few, subcontinentals probably in the mix there. So chalk this up to, DEI mass migration or something, but it was definitely one of those things that is going to be escalating and increasing, and I think it's one of those things where they're getting people kind of primed for this idea that a big cyber attack, will bring down kind of the functions of the economy and the infrastructure and transportation, and that kind of thing would be enough, even more so than a few thousand people dying in an actual terrorist attack. Some might say that would be something that would really prime the pump for people to go to war against a power like Iran or China or Russia, who people claim have these cyber capabilities to bring down, the grid or bring down telecommunications or bring down, I don't know, planes falling out of the sky. Imagine the ideal apocalyptic situation for somebody trying to start a war and, demonize an enemy. But I think the fact that this is happening more and more and we hear more and more about these big outages, and especially with airlines, they're always experiencing some hacks or outages and everything. It's going to become one of those things where people are going to have to adapt to the fact that these major systems and corporations aren't as impervious and invulnerable as people might have thought they were, because and who knows, maybe that will lead to more of a decentralization in some of these big monopolies like in air travel or cybersecurity or some of these other things. So, you know, generally a pretty scary thing, and who knows if the deep state will latch on to more of that as a psyop tool. I'm pretty convinced that they will, but unless you have any comments on the cyber warfare situation, maybe even in general, what you think is going to come of that, we need to definitely talk about the future of negotiations in Russia with Zelensky and Putin, and, what we think is actually going to happen on the ground.
Yeah, no, I think just briefly, it's worth mentioning that CrowdStrike share prices, because it is a publicly owned company, they have fallen by 20%. So potentially there were, people, certain folks prior to the launching of the update, they were shorting that company. So, and that's quite significant. A 20% drop is, it's not the companies are going bankrupt, but people's trust in it has fallen quite significantly. So, there's definitely people who have made money from whatever this crisis was, and definitely, there were payment processes going down, planes not being able to fly. So, it does kind of paint a futuristic perspective of what will take place in a World War III type scenario, and how many, and like, what do we truly know, Conrad, like epistemologically speaking, about the softwares that run our society, frankly, like behind the scenes? Like, have the general, the average person, what have we heard about CrowdStrike or some of these other softwares which Microsoft and a lot of Fortune 500 companies actually rely on? And this seems like a very basic firewall type program which a lot of these companies need to run to in order to just enact basic services. And in fact, we don't know anything, frankly. And a lot of this is not being reported on. A lot of this is essentially tech heavy software journals which report on a lot of these things. So until the crisis actually strikes, if we're not prepared by even having cash on hand, a lot of our cards, for example, may not even function at certain stores, which is exactly what happened in the last few days. So yeah, I think it's a big wake up call, similar to how COVID in a way was a wake up call about the medical industrial complex. So very interesting, and yes, definitely in the future as World War III escalates, as we see the invasion of Taiwan, the involvement of for more countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and possibly even Israel getting completely unhinged in the Middle East, we will definitely see further sort of attempts to perhaps hijack certain software companies, or even launch more hacking attacks against various world infrastructure, I think. So definitely. But the other thing, speaking about markets, right, and like shorting shares, there was a very interesting another conspiracy angle, which this is like the new JFK shooting, Conrad. So there's definitely a lot of different stories, but a very large hedge fund, actually, Austin Private Wealth, shorted Truth Social, which is Trump's media, essentially like his Twitter X alternative, by selling, or at least shorting, 12,000 shares literally a few days prior to the assassination attempt, almost as if, and I'm going to say allegedly, as if they knew that the assassination attempt was going to take place, and if Trump was, say, to be killed, then of course Truth Social, without Trump's personality cult, it would definitely go down as a company, and this short would be quite a lucrative move market-wise. So it's being investigated at the moment. There's a lot of very bizarre. I mean, normally this is almost like the 9/11 shorting the airlines, right, or like the various companies related to the Twin Towers. I mean, it's just crazy, and this is, of course, what else can we call it? Like Kabbalistic Jewish market science. So all very, very weird. And, it does go into places like the Ukraine, where a lot of money is, I mean, it's a big money laundering operation. And Zelensky's money laundering operation, this is why, Zelensky is simply just the manager of it. So there's a lot of this big talk by Trump that he can finally like give Putin all this land that Putin allegedly wants in order to calm down the alleged beast of the deep state of Russia, that it wants these Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk territories. I think that's wishful thinking, because you need to consider, Conrad, Trump hasn't been the commander-in-chief in 4 years. There have been very serious people in charge of NATO from the US's side, as well as in Europe as well, very serious clans, the Rothschilds, various other big companies behind the entire Ukrainian war project. So if you think about it, the Ukrainian war commenced under the Biden administration. There was no Trump's involvement, and he's right, the war did not take place in any capacity under his leadership. And so a lot of the decisions that have been made were made in his absence. And he was banned off a lot of social media companies and platforms since January 6th. So he wasn't, frankly, involved in any capacity, even in like a multimedia public relations type of way. So you have to consider that these people have invested in this Ukraine project a long time ago, and they've invested even heavier since 2022. And for Trump to come in from the outside and simply tell them, look, you've built up all these defenses in the Donetsk Oblast and Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Toretsk, which is now being taken by Russia, and all these other places. You built these cement fortresses and mined up all these fields, and suddenly you have to give up all this territory to Russia because they want a peace deal. And the Russian economy is allegedly, according to the liberals online, it is suffering greatly, and it's going to collapse any minute now. But frankly, I don't think that's probably the case. Russia is more China aligned, more India aligned at the moment. We see this with Modi visiting Putin, so that's probably not going to take place. But still, there is this consideration that, do we really need to give Russia all this territory in Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, especially on the left bank of the Dnieper, the so-called, well, geographically speaking, would be the right bank, because the Dnieper River runs from south to north. So all that area, including Kherson City, Zaporozhye City, which is directly aligned to Dnieper, the city of Dnipropetrovsk, which we know there's a giant Jewish community there. Why would Trump give all that territory up just for a peace treaty? Because this is what wants. This is constitutionally what Russia consists of, these four large territories. Naturally, Kharkov is not in the mix, but Russia would need to leave these major cities such as Volchansk, which is being bombed at the moment, into, the Russian artillery is making a real job out of Volchansk, frankly, because the Ukrainians are stubbornly holding onto it. So there is that consideration, Conrad, is would NATO's leadership, regardless of what Trump has to say, would it go along with some of these ideas? Because, again, these defensive positions built up in the Ukrainian landscape in these territories, they're going to take decades to restore on the new border lines, which are drawn, say, along the borders of Kherson, Zaporozhye, these new borders which potentially Putin would want to draw in Ukraine if Russia was to take its so-called rightful territory according to its constitution. So Trump's deal would need to, I think, take that into account if he wants to achieve some sort of realistic outcome here. And I think Zelensky, well, all this rhetoric about taking Crimea will need to be flushed down the toilet. I don't think that's relevant at all going into the future. And all these bizarre ideas of building cannabis, weed farms in the Crimea for the Crimean Tatars to smoke weed and stuff because they don't drink alcohol. I think all of those ideas, all these drug-related plans need to as well go out the window. I think the future is that Crimea will remain Russian, will remain Russian Orthodox. There won't be any persecution there. So just your thoughts, Conrad, about what this peace treaty, which the RNC, I mean, it was a big deal at the RNC spoken about, what it will sort of encompass and what the potential future will look like.
Well, going back to my previous comments about Trump already, doing diplomacy, even though he hasn't even won the election yet, let alone been inaugurated. This was recently from Zelensky. He said, "I spoke with Donald Trump to congratulate him on the Republican nomination and condemn the shocking assassination attempt in Pennsylvania. I wish him strength and absolute safety in the future. I noted the vital bipartisan and bicameral American support for protecting our nation's freedom and independence. Ukraine will always be grateful to the United States for its help in strengthening our ability to resist Russian terror. Russian attacks on our cities and villages continue every day. We agreed with President Trump to discuss at a personal meeting what steps can make peace fair and truly lasting." And this comes after, of course, Zelensky said he's willing to talk with Russian negotiators and Russian leadership about, what to do next. And I think ultimately what this peace deal is going to look like, I think it actually has to do with why we see our good friend Igor Girkin Strelkov moved to, an official, more long-term, prison facility, because unfortunately it seems that, as you said, Dmitry, it's likely that what we're going to see is Crimea, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Lugansk, and Donetsk become Russian, and then perhaps Kharkov, Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk become this sort of gray zone, and then the rest of it remains Ukrainian, which, again, I don't think that is that great of a deal, if I'm being 100% honest. Sure, it's still on the Russian victory side of, the famous chart that we all kind of became acquainted with at the beginning of the SMO, what would be a Russian Pyrrhic victory versus a real Russian victory. And I think it's a true Russian victory in some capacity, but the fact that we heard so much talk about Odessa, so much talk about Kharkov, so much talk about, again, these regions that border Belgorod. Belgorod has had to be shut down in some capacity, put in a total state of emergency. Military has had to move in to actually protect the civilians as if they were, in the SMO zone effectively. So this is a real thing. And I think the fact that there's a chance that these negotiations might result in a, let's say from a Russian nationalist perspective, a less than desired amount of territory gained, they definitely would not want somebody like Strelkov talking to his millions of Telegram followers about, about why this is and who might be behind it and this, that, or the other. So I'm hoping that the settlement will be better than what I'm saying right now. I hope it's definitely not worse. That would be terrible. But Dmitry, I'd love your thoughts on Strelkov and what you think is actually going to happen, because, if they get the full territories that are claimed by the Constitution right now, that's, specifically Zaporozhye is probably the biggest thing that would be in the news. That's a city of, at one point at least over 500,000 people, well over. And all those people, I'm sure there are many pro-Ukrainian people there that would in theory have to become part of Russia. They would probably leave. A lot of them would move, I would assume. But the fact that they're already going to be doing that, I don't see why you would then just, because some of these places have large cities, why that would be the reason why you kind of view it as politically impossible to annex them or to regain them, or do referendums or try to reach a sort of political solution that protects the church, protects Russian speakers, and actually prevents war from breaking out in the future over the exact same issues.
Look, I think there's definitely that possibility, and those of us, especially Christians, who are very pro-peace and they really want this to be resolved in a peaceful fashion, they want the persecution to end, and for that to even be a significant factor in these peace talk considerations, which it really hasn't been, despite the discussions at the UN and various the Russians actually the Russian Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church bringing up this subject of persecution over and over again. It really hasn't been like a major consideration in the peace talks, but going into the future, I think, regardless of if the borders are drawn along down the middle of the Donetsk Oblast, or if only the Donetsk Oblast and the 5% remaining under Ukrainian control of Lugansk is given to Russia and Zaporozhye, Kherson is cut in half, I think we're looking at a temporary peace treaty at most, right? I think the world is still going to, unfortunately, tumble into this World War III type scenario. I think the elites have made up their minds. And in fact, even us, Christian people around the world, we have drowned ourselves in sin and complacency and lukewarmness to the point where, this can only be resolved through one particular way, and that's through a general sobering up through calamity. Right, we have had this peaceful existence for about 60, 70 years, perhaps slightly longer, if we don't look at conflicts such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, etc. But for some regions, really, existence hasn't been peaceful. It's been always really high strung. It's been very stressful. We look at countries like Yugoslavia, Kosovo. There's a lot of lands, a lot of countrysides which are always affected by ethnic, religious tensions, and I think the world is essentially in this really tense state. So even if a peace treaty is struck between Russia and Ukraine, it will only be temporary. And this is not just my idea. This is something that even Igor Strelkov has spoken about, right, multiple times. He said that a peace treaty will only allow Ukraine to train up its F-16 pilots, to train up its tank brigades, and actually plan for the future assault onto Russian territories. The idea of a Ukrainian state, and this is, frankly, like, let's just bring it up, Gabriel Doroshin himself recently said that any peace treaty with Ukraine will only lead to Ukrainian nationalism to be built up and for their forces to further sort of establish themselves on the territory, because Ukraine, its very existence, it's like the analogy can be made. Ukraine is like an antichrist type of entity, like a country, a nation state, which exists only to deny its own personal Russianness and Russian history. It feeds off negativity, unfortunately. And yes, maybe a lot of clergymen of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church will not, and probably shouldn't, frankly, admit this openly. But this is exactly what the saints like Elder Zosima, Elder Jonah of Odessa, and St. Lawrence of Chernigov spoke about. The fact that Ukraine really is always an integral part of Russia, and denying this is actually anti-Christian and anti-Russian, anti-patriotic. Really, you're not really loving your neighbor. It's more like a feeding off of negativity. And I think, notice, all the based patriots in Russia agree with this, and all the based patriots out of Ukraine, Oleg Tsaryov, Paul Gubaryov, actually, who just came out from another like 6 month stint. Remember, he had that argument with Igor Strelkov before Strelkov went into the long prison sentence. Paul Gubaryov, and they broke up that right-wing oppositionary movement. He went straight back to the SMO, and he's just returned, and he's kind of giving his opinion online. So a lot of these people, they all agree Ukraine as an entity cannot exist long term, because it will only destroy just this particular land upon which it exists and upon which it feeds like a parasitical leech. And given the people in command in Ukraine, I think we can definitely say there's definitely something vampiric and parasitical about it all. I mean, I'm not getting into any sort of deep anti-Semitic conspiracies, but we can kind of see that as the main theme of this landscape. So I think that's the real conclusion we can all agree with, and frankly, the saints of the Ukrainian land agree with us too.
No, I totally agree, and I think the reality of the cascading World War III leading to, at best, what would be a temporary ceasefire in Ukraine is completely accurate, because we just saw breaking news. Lavrov has released some pretty extensive statements about the situation in the Holy Land. I'm just going to read them right now. Israel provokes Hezbollah with the aim of dragging the American army into a major conflict. It is Hezbollah that acts with great restraint. This is from Lavrov himself. Israel, not Iran, is interested in escalation, while the Russian Federation is doing everything to avoid escalation. I cannot make this any more clear. The Russian Federation will not remain an observer of an escalation and will take its responsibilities. Look at Syria as an example. And this comes amid reports that the Israeli strikes on Yemen were not unanimously approved by the war cabinet. Several ministers apparently did not support the attack. This is from Khan News, which is a big source in Israel. And the Israeli spokespeople have also come out and quote-unquote clarified that the US and the UK were not in any way involved in the attack, and that they did inform Joe Biden beforehand, but that there was no actual US involvement. So they're trying to show the US that they are very much, like, we're going to play ball with you here. We're not trying to throw you under the bus or anything. But at the same time, everybody's on high alert for the supposed Houthi response, which I assume the Houthis prepared for some kind of big escalation from Israel and in theory had already prepared a further escalatory response. So we're going to be watching all of this very closely, but apparently the other reports were that the Israeli forces were actually wanting to strike all across the axis of resistance. They wanted to strike the Houthis in Yemen at the same time as they struck the popular mobilization forces in Iraq and Syria and also Hezbollah. So perhaps this was a moderated version of what would have been one of the most dramatic strikes we've seen in the Middle East since probably the Iraq War. So I think a lot of things are going on right now. The fact that Lavrov has weighed in, and clearly I think this is a dramatic shift towards the Palestinian Islamic side for Russia. Not that they hadn't already been on the side of Palestinian recognition, but this is a dramatic shift towards the like almost implying that they would support the axis of resistance. This perhaps does give some credence to the reports that the Russians would arm the Houthis with air defense, or that they would support Hezbollah, or that they would perhaps help Assad facilitate the transportation, of weapons from Syria, from Iraq over to the Golan Heights, Lebanon, perhaps future war zone in that entire region. So, very interesting developments to say the least. Russia is very much aware of the reality of World War III, and that Ukraine is almost going to get even if Ukraine gets put on the back burner, that doesn't mean that the situation won't stop escalating and that everyone needs to stay on high alert. But yeah, you mentioned Gabriel Doroshin. He also recently met up with somebody that we talk about specifically in your ritual regicide articles, Dimitri. So before we talk about Cyprus, we should probably talk about that pretty epic link up.
Yeah, of course, there's been the fantastical so-called Tsar's Days, the 17th of July, 18th of July celebrations in Yekaterinburg, which is, right on essentially the Perm Governorate, the Perm region. These are like the gateway regions into Siberia. Essentially, you could almost say Siberia, the city of Yekaterinburg, where the martyrdom of the Romanov royal family took place over 100 years ago now. And the celebration was huge. I think this was the biggest one thus far, probably since their canonization. You've had 13 hierarchs of the Orthodox Church, essentially bishops led by Metropolitan Eugene of Yekaterinburg, of course, the famous pro-SMO bishop, one of the bishops we brought up in our 8th hour episode regarding hierarchs who are, sort of based and very conservative in their leanings, very much according to the church fathers, very correct in their views. And, he was one of the bishops we briefly brought up because he was always, pro-Ukrainian territory annexation in regards to the areas which have had church persecution on them. And he was always saying that this was like a positive move by Russia, and this was one of Russia's responsibilities, is that they would need to protect some of these regions and people, and essentially the Orthodox Church there. Of course, the other really chief bishop in this particular meeting was the Metropolitan Vincent of Tashkent in Uzbekistan. Metropolitan Vincent is very much known as an ascetic in Tashkent, and he was their very strong sort of church father physiognomy. There's some pretty powerful photographs being given. Some of the other bishops alongside Metropolitan Vincent were, of course, there was a representative of the Patriarch of Antioch. So that's the Syrian link we just spoke about, that international relations link to the Assad regime, and the fact that he supports the Antiochian church, where you notice an Antiochian bishop, of course, attend this great celebration of the Romanov royal martyrs. There was a Serbian Bishop Stefan of Remesiana there as well, an archimandrite from the Church of the Czech lands in Slovakia, and of course Archpriest Daniel, who is a representative of the Orthodox Church of America. So very much a very jointly collective, synodal, and you can say Catholic in the Orthodox sense, gathering here in Yekaterinburg. And again, the other really powerful thing, Conrad, was that we did see our good friend Konstantin Malafeyev, the CEO and Russian Orthodox billionaire. He was there, the CEO of Tsargrad. He was there walking alongside Metropolitan Eugene and Vincent in the front lines of the massive procession which took place, the 21-kilometer procession, which is roughly 13 miles in American metrics, from the Church of the Savior and Spilled Blood from Yekaterinburg, which stood on the place of the Ipatiev house, out of the city to Ganyana Yama, where the bodies of the royal martyrs were dismembered and destroyed. And this massive procession, it was about 45, perhaps almost, probably, my guess would be up to 60,000 people participated in it. I think a lot of people probably didn't complete the procession because it was a very hot day and a very hot evening that night. So yeah, it was a massive Orthodox gathering. And of course, for us, what's very interesting is that Peter Multatuli had a meetup, as you said, Conrad, with Gabriel Doroshin. Both of these people directly linked, even by ancestral bloodline, to those martyrs of the Ipatiev house. Peter Multatuli was one of the co-authors or one of the people who assisted in writing the famous book about the Romanov royal family in the English language, which we always advocate people read. And in fact, Conrad speaks about it. Conrad has a copy of it. I have an electronic copy. It's just very much a must-read in the English language. And Peter Multatuli was the descendant. He's the great grandson of Ivan Kharitonov, who is a saint in the Orthodox Church. He's the chef of Tsar Nicholas II, who was also killed, ritually murdered by the Bolsheviks in the basement of the Ipatiev house. And naturally, Gabriel the Russian, as we already know, he's the descendant of Tsar Nicholas I. So he's essentially a very distantly removed cousin of Nicholas II, the Russian Tsars. And so the Romanov blood does run in his veins, and him meeting with Peter Multatuli is very key, Conrad, for a few reasons. But I think primarily is the fact that Peter Multatuli, he's one of our main sources for the articles we're writing on the ritual regicide of the Romanovs, the ritual regicide, really sort of well-acquainted articles that are being published, the future book that will be released by World War Now, essentially probably the first book that we'll publish. Peter Multatuli is one of the main authors that we'll be citing because he's probably he's one of the top 4 real historians in Russia at the moment who are actually focusing on the fact that the Romanov martyrs were ritually murdered and not simply shot via execution by the Bolsheviks as some sort of political assassination of some sort, right? There was a deeper, darker conspiracy at play, which I think historically the facts do actually point into this direction. So him meeting with Gabriel the Russian, a Donbass veteran of 6 to 10 years, right? Gabriel the Russian's been so active. He's an actual warrior, an Orthodox Christian, emigre, a descendant of the Russian Orthodox emperors. I mean, it's a powerful connection here. And the only missing link, unfortunately, is our good friend Igor Strelkov, who is currently sitting in the Kirovskaya Oblast prison. He was moved to a sort of less secure prison in the Kirovskaya Oblast, which is next to Yekaterinburg. It's just north of Kazan along the Volga River. So if you can imagine north of Volgograd, north of Stalingrad, in that region up there. So still close, but not close enough. He would have made a great addition alongside Andrei Afanasyev, Gabriel the Russian, Konstantin Malafeyev, who, Strelkov was the bodyguard of Konstantin Malafeyev's daughter back when she was, I believe, a teenager. He used to take her to high school and stuff. So all these people know each other. The Russian monarchist movement is more alive than it's ever been. And I think this is very concerning, especially for the Jewish lobby in Russia, not just because of Lavrov's recent statements, Conrad, in terms of foreign policy and the fact that Russian Jews may receive more of a beating in terms of, well, I don't mean this in the pogrom sense, I mean this in the rhetorical, like, they're going to lose a lot of their clout inside of the Russian government. The Israeli Zionist position will be lost, but also domestically speaking, as Russia moves towards a further, more broader celebration of the Romanov royal martyrs, they will begin questioning their own history, and they'll start understanding exactly who the Bolsheviks were, who the communists were, and a lot of the things we speak about here on the show will become mainstream in Russia more than it is now. And I think this is what they fear, but they can't really stop this because events such as this, which took place in Yekaterinburg, it's organic, it's unfunded. People came here, people paid for it themselves. There's no government funding involved at all. The procession is a natural, ground up, you can say, ground roots, organized Orthodox Christian endeavor. And I think that gives us a lot of hope because, in fact, it may be one of the largest collective Orthodox Christian events that takes place, besides, of course, the celebration of Easter and other feast days around the world. So huge white pill, I think, for all Orthodox Christians around the world. And we look forward to even more news from that particular area. Who knows what those powerful Orthodox Christian monarchists spoke about behind the scenes, what kind of ideas they were sharing. But it's always exciting to share this sort of good news with you guys.
Well, the pictures were super cool. I think I would love to make it to Yekaterinburg and these places for, some of these processions at some point in my life. I think many Orthodox Christians should try to do the same. But I think the situation overall between the Russian, monarchist situation and those that perhaps have a different persuasion is, broadly speaking, moving in the right direction. I think more and more people are realizing that, Tsar Nicholas II is a much more admirable figure than Lenin or any of these other revolutionary characters, and that as Orthodoxy, continues to make its mark, that's going to become more, apparent, not even necessarily in a political sense immediately, but very much, I think, in a spiritual sense. And Malofeyev and Multatuli and Doroshin, they all understand that as well. And the monarchists that I spoke to in Russia, they believe that in that spiritual revival, the real czar, the true political czar, will emerge completely organically. Like it won't be some kind of political machinations. It will be something that they believe, at least, that God will make fairly clear in the context of the time. So I think that's something that we can look forward to. But As Russia continues to take towns in all sorts of directions, again on the front line, Kupiansk, again, the troops are in Belgorod. They're also pushing in the Sumy and Kharkov directions still, and of course, the Donetsk region is still the primary focus of the fighting. But moving away from there, we do need to briefly talk about Cyprus, which, again, my article that I wrote, which has done quite well, it was republished on Helleniscope. It's already, being somewhat fulfilled. Of course, the Northern Cyprus transportation minister asked for a Turkish naval base in Northern Cyprus, and apparently those plans are already going to be moving forward. And this is in response to Cyprus unveiling plans for a new major naval base in the south, the Republic of Cyprus, the Greek-speaking side, which will apparently be a Cypriot national base, but will be built with consultation and help and undoubtedly collaborate with the Greek government and the Greek Navy. So the Northern Cypriots and the Turks viewed that as an escalation, so now they plan on building a big base in TRNC, the unrecognized Republic of Northern Cyprus, which again has less than half the population, is only a third of the island, and is only recognized by Turkey. Read my article about how that might change in the future, but it does seem that the situation in Cyprus is going to continue to escalate, and I'm almost surprised that Cyprus wasn't more involved in this strike on the Houthis. We know that Houthi drone came in from the Mediterranean Sea. I'm wondering if the Israelis are going to be putting pressure on the Cypriots to, let them use their bases, to allow the Brits, to pressure the Brits to let them use their bases, at Dioclea and these others that are completely British territory, also major U.S. intelligence zones. So, Cyprus getting dragged into the situation in the Levant as it escalates with Hezbollah, with the Houthis, with the Popular Mobilization Forces, with Iran. I talk about that in the article as well, that delineation between, Greek and Turkish, that might become also part of the Levant issue with Israel and Palestine. And unfortunately, most Greek nationalists have no interest in supporting Israel. So it's very unfortunate if, the Republic of Cyprus is going to get dragged in and they're going to get attacked by Hezbollah and they're going to be used as a launching point for Zionist genocide. It's really an unfortunate situation going on there. But unless you have anything to say about that, or perhaps any final frontline updates from Russia, we probably need to talk about the French situation, because Macron recently made remarks about how Azerbaijan is the problem in Armenia, but he probably has a lot bigger concerns than small disputes in the Caucasus, considering that, his people are getting pushed out of power at every turn as the left and, National Rally and the opposition are filling in these slots in the French government.
Yeah, look, I think the French situation for Macron, frankly, is quite dire, and I don't think it's a very similar position to Biden. Actually, he's not able to change his view on France's foreign policy at the moment. So, the French ships are still present in the Red Sea. French interest is still firmly planted in Georgia, despite the fact that Georgia is really pivoting more towards the orthodox conservative angle. France is not really removing its interest from the region, and frankly, it's just really curious because we do see this sort of weird Brexit phantom come up again, right, Conrad? This rivalry, almost you can say century-long rivalry between France and the UK, because at the European Political Community Forum, which took place, the EPC, the summit took place in the UK. You had Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister of the UK, actually bring up Ilhan Aliyev and Pashinyan together. Basically, we're on the same stage, and still there was no peace treaty or no peace talks, no even discussion about Nagorno-Karabakh or where the conflict will sort of move forward. And this is like the UK, right? This is the country which huge long-ranging interests in northern Iran, North Persia, the Caspian Sea, the Rothschild family investing in it. Frankly, it was the French Rothschilds who invested in the Baku oil fields, as we discuss in our articles, our Ritual War. Actually, it's worth reading, actually, because those articles, not only are they relevant to what's happening in Chechnya, Dagestan, but they also talk about the Southern Caucasus region as well. So it's all very much related. We don't just publish random articles for you guys. They're all very much linked into the theme of the show, and not just the theme, but also world news, things which we think will be relevant to you guys, and some of the things I think our listeners are interested in. But that sort of theme, right? France now heavily transitioning, Conrad, into this strange joint government between Macron, Macron now electing this new woman speaker of the French parliament, right? Having her from his party, which will essentially, at least French political commentators are stating that Macron, because of all these various coalitions within the French political system, will need to concede. And the prime minister, for the first time in a while, will be from a different party, will be from one of the far left parties of France and not from Macron's party. So Macron will have the speaker. Meanwhile, the left wing will have this new prime minister who at the moment is still unnamed. We're not too sure who the prime minister of France will be. Perhaps by the time this episode comes out, the news will already be broken. But yes, Macron will not have the strong, firm hold over France anymore, which I think will be incredibly stressful for him because he's always played this bizarre Napoleon III type character during the Crimean War, or maybe like Napoleon Bonaparte. And he's just a very weird character to begin with, like this Rothschild banker type of man. Very strange. Keir Starmer, I mean, all these people are super questionable in terms of their histories. They're all very negative from different perspectives, right? You have Rothschild bankers, you have Trotskyite, Keir Starmer. Like it's all highly, highly anti-Christian, like in every single aspect. It's almost funny, caricaturish, right? You could say. But nevertheless, we do cover these news. So Pashinyan, Aliyev in the same city in the UK, in London, like the king is there, and still there's no sort of peace treaty, and France remains staunchly behind Armenia. And that's really interesting. And that's, I think, Conrad, because there's a deeper consideration going into this future, investment into Greece as well, and potentially France assisting Greece and Armenia in this future so-called Christian fight against the Turks, which, as we understand at the moment, Greek politics aren't very Christian, nor domestically, nor even in terms of foreign policy, right? They are fighting off Turkish aggression, so-called Turkish soft pressure, but in regards to Turkey threatening to release immigrants and refugees onto Greek land, I understand that's actually quite European and Christian of Greece to do that. But France is a heavily Masonic country. Greece is currently under this yoke of the Freemasons. So I think the connection is less of a Christian one. It's less has to do with crusades and these sort of Christian ties which go back centuries, and more to do with exactly who is in which lodge and who's related by degree, if you know what I mean. So I think this is France's consideration, is that despite if Macron is replaced in the next few years and Macron doesn't run for the presidency, the French political system will continue to remain anti-Turkish for whatever reason, and will continue to remain pro-Christian in a really broad umbrella sense, which is why we'll see France continue to support these anti-Turkic countries such as Armenia and Greece. And it may seem bizarre from the outside, but I think a lot more will make sense as further news develop in this particular region of the world.
Well, it's super interesting because the only thing where that kind of makes sense as well is if you bring in the historical closer connection with France and Russia compared to, again, we know the Napoleon thing happened, but compared to the reality of, the absolute monarchy getting brutally slaughtered in a modernistic revolution, the fact that there are many Russophiles in France, there are many Francophiles in Russia. Gabriel de Rochin himself grew up in France, is from France, his, white emigre ancestors and whatnot, and his earlier royal ancestors, that was where they had decided to reside. So the fact that that connection exists perhaps could give a hint as to some dramatic shifts in the World War III landscape that may come to pass before things go really hot. But I'm, not making too much speculation there. But you mentioned, of course, France supporting Armenia, Azerbaijan. This is funny because Baku, Azerbaijan, they recently organized a Congress for the Independence of French Colonies. So we see they released a graphic, and it's Azerbaijan in the center, and then it's every single one of the French colonies. You've got Mayotte and Réunion off the coast of Africa. You've got, Terre Adelaide and these other tiny ones way down near Antarctica. You have, of course, New Caledonia. You've got all of the other French Polynesian and Melanesian and, South Pacific territories. They're talking about Guadeloupe, Saint Martin, Martinique, even Miquelon and Bartholomé, which are the ones right off the coast of Canada that are still technically under the jurisdiction of France. These are all on this graphic, and we know that Azerbaijan was supporting unrest in New Caledonia, so they are really committed to this anti-France. France is now their number one op, it would seem. So Azerbaijan and France are very much at war, and that kind of coincides, unfortunately, with Russia and France being very much not okay, with Macron being, again, we previously talked about, he was the most gung-ho about putting actual troops on the ground. I think he may have kind of not really understood the situation that was going on. He kind of, I think, slipped up a little bit there because everyone was like, chill, bro, chill. We're not there yet. But, here we see Azerbaijan, friends with Lukashenko, friends with Russia, Armenia now out of the CSTO. So very dramatic landscape shifts in that regard. But I think the fact that we're still seeing Pashinyan in power, the fact that, the Armenians are unhappy with him, but somehow like it's not enough to where they're actually going to, physically throw him out of power and do a revolution. I guess the US and the French soft power with Pashinyan is enough to prevent that from happening. I assume if Pashinyan hadn't solicited the support from Western sponsors, he wouldn't be able to have maintained this without an actual more violent coup from the other direction. But unless you have anything else to say about perhaps persecutions in Ukraine or other situations in any of these fronts, Dimitri, we could probably land this plane.
Yeah, I think the main sort of bit of news that came out over the last 7 days, it's just a really sort of sad story because we keep hearing about these psychological warfare sort of health related tactics used by the Ukrainian terror state. So big prayers for Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy. The name may be familiar to you because we've reported on him quite a few times, but also he's made big news because he was one of the main Ukrainian hierarchs who has been imprisoned under house arrest. He's appeared on trial multiple times, like Metropolitan Jonathan, like Metropolitan Longin, and he suffered a heart attack actually a few days ago. So he's currently in hospital recovering. Metropolitan Theodosius, he was the hierarch in that famous sacrilegious clip wherein, remember, he was attending the courtroom, Conrad, and there was that that big poster of Patriarch Kirill that these Ukrainian Banderite libtards actually put on the ground, and they're like, okay, you have to walk over Patriarch Kirill's
Hmm.
image. That's the hierarch that had the heart attack. And so what we have is we're looking at all these various hierarchs having heart attacks, strokes. Metropolitan Jonathan had a stroke. Now he's in safety, recovering from it. Metropolitan Longin was beaten physically, had a heart attack, had a heart surgery. Now Metropolitan Theodosius, who is under house arrest and is going for all his appeals, judicial trials, has also gone down with a heart attack. I mean, it's just clearly there is something very demonic happening in the Ukraine. I think we've clearly sort of dotted the I's and crossed the T's, but I think the world community really needs to look more towards this. I mean, even various Christian countries around Europe need to be more outspoken about this, frankly. So it's really quite sad. So keep Metropolitan Theodosius in your prayers, and this is just one more sort of dash in terms of the Ukrainian regime sort of persecuting Orthodox Christians further. Metropolitan Arsenius his lawyers continue to try and appeal his sentence. He's going to be sentenced for at least, I believe, 5 to 7 years. That's the prognosis for allegedly pointing out in one of his sermons the positions of Ukrainian forces outside of the Svyatogorsk Monastery, which is the monastery in the background of our eighth hour episodes, actually, that beautiful holy White Mountain Monastery in the Donetsk countryside, right near the river. And it's just, it's quite weird. They're claiming that he allegedly facilitated Igor Strelkov and some of his commandos prior to them going into Slavyansk. So all of these stories that we bring you guys are all somehow interrelated, which only shows that I think not just we are, but world history, I think, is turning in a very dramatic way here. So keep all the persecuted hierarchs, laity, clergymen in your prayers. I think is very important. And of course, pray for all those poor Palestinian people and the people of the Levant who are currently suffering under some of the worst war-like depravities that we've seen in recent years.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think we need to keep everybody in all fronts of World War III, including the home front in our own Western countries, in our prayers as we see ourselves possibly descending into that with drafts and broader military escalations happening all over. So we're watching all of this very closely, but be sure to subscribe to the Substack to support the show at worldwarnow.co. That's where you can get behind the paywall, listen to every episode of Ether Hour. We had our big recent episode with David Patrick Harry from Church of the Eternal Logos. We talk about magic, prophecy, the mechanics behind the occult, and how magic is something that actually affects us every day, and how the powers that be in the media are actively casting spells and charging sigils and doing all sorts of these things to enact their nefarious wills. So be sure to listen to that. It'll be linked below. We're going to hopefully have more conversations in the future. He's also on the World War III wave, so a lot of things to collaborate about, obviously. So yeah, worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com, both links work. Be sure to follow the World War Now Twitter, World War Now _, follow the World War Now Telegram channel, World War Now TELE, Telly. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, leave a comment, like the videos, of course, share them, get us up to 4,000 subscribers. We're almost there. We're hopefully going to do more live streams on the channel in the very near future, so subscribe and look forward to that. Obviously, subscribe on the Rumble channel. I'm hopefully going to get the backups up there too. We want to build the Rumble audience. Follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Obviously, the feasts of the Royal Martyrs and St. Paisios were celebrated recently, so be sure to pray to those wonderful and great saints. And again, keep everybody in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, in the Patriarchate of Jerusalem and Antioch that are suffering under Israeli strikes, and for church unity around the entire world, that you would keep all of that in your prayers. And with all of that, again, leave a comment, subscribe, share, support the show, get behind the paywall to hear all the Ether Hours And with all of that, again, thank you so much for listening, and God bless.